Hey there, my name's Ashok. I am the CEO of Integral, and I'm going to talk about a low friction framework for defining your minimum viable product, and it's called Smallest Viable Market. So, a few years ago, it was just a few months before the Consumer Elect Vegas, and plans were underway for a launch event for an app that I was working on. Everyone was excited about the accomplishment that we were working towards in this launch, and also feeling a little bit uncertain about whether or not we could deliver. Um, whoops. There were still a few complex problems that we hadn't solved yet, and there was the pressure of a lot riding on the successful launch. And this uncertainty was starting to get the better of our teams. Our product owners who had kickoff were very confident. We're starting to kind of seem a little shaky about whether they thought customers would be delighted by our app. We found them trying to add more features or cater to more people. And then our engineering teams had to kind of balance out all these new requirements coming in and these changes with feeling confident about getting it done on time and getting a really reliable product out on time. And these fears on both sides started to creep into the relationship between the product and engineering teams. And I found myself in finger pointing conversations that weren't helping us, our counterparts in the product team, or especially the customers that we were looking to delight. As a product manager, I distinctly remember the term minimum viable product, or MVP, turning into kind of a trigger word for everyone. And CES is a major conference, and just like the Super Bowl, they weren't going to move their dates for our timelines. So we had to trim features here and there in order to meet the stiff deadlines and the asks of the business team. In that case, thankfully, we were able to launch the app at the event, and we had to make some healthy compromises in order to get there, and things went okay. What concerned me about it was that it wasn't the first time that I found myself caught in this constraint satisfaction exercise that seemed fruitless. It wasn't the first time that I found myself in the midst of unproductive meetings and arguments, and they weren't really adding any value to our customers. And it wasn't the first time that I found myself as an audience to unkind conversations amongst colleagues. And so this weighed heavily on me, and I kind of felt like there would be a better way. So I do as I often do and go back to the first principles. And at the time, I was a product manager, and I went to our principles of how we think about building products. So in the spirit of lean and human-centered design, we like to think about who we're building for first, and then what problem that person has, and only then think about what the solution is. And as we kind of go through it in that order, customer first, problem second, solution third, that solution circle there, or solution step, leads to the roadmap and the backlogs that our engineering team works on and builds into a product. This was really valuable for us in a variety of ways to kind of take this approach of 1, 2, 3, whether it was calibrating the focus of our team, and our problem solving, or prioritizing the utilization of our time and budget. And when it came to trimming features, and we had these dreaded MVP battles, we'd mostly focus on step 3 here, trying to see what we can get away without. And therein lay our problem. While we were being very human-centered and customer-centric in our approach to ideating the best features, we forgot to be customer-centric when we were having to trim our scope. So the question I ask is, instead of starting with step 3 at trimming, can we start at step number 1? Can we find a smaller audience that we can focus on that would maybe lead to us having to solve fewer problems, and then ultimately having fewer solutions initially? And then we'd be able to get the app launched early and get feedback early. We'd be able to kind of meet budgetary and timeline constraints. And ideally, if we pick the right audience to start with, they're the folks that we can really delight and rely on some referrals and some organic marketing after. So at this point, there are three questions that most teams want to ask. You want to know, okay, what is the smallest market and how do I choose it? Do I choose the largest segment? Do I choose the customer? Do I choose the segment that most has the problem? Then what next? How do we scale this? If we're starting small, we still have our business plans and money kind of big. And how do we scale and get the rest of the revenue and profit that we're expecting? And the third one is, hey, instead of doing it all at once, taking this kind of approach of slicing it up, doesn't that get expensive? So I'll cover these one by one. And let's start with the smallest market. And for that, I'm going to borrow some of the learnings from an author called Jeffrey Moore, who released what's now a textbook called Crossing the Chasm. And he segments the market into these various segments. And the innovators and the early adopters are the folks that generally will be an audience for products that have traction. And then he argues that there's a chasm after that to get beyond those early two segments into the rest of the market. And that's where a lot of products fail. What doesn't change is that we need to kind of target these individually. So borrowing from that, what is now I would call science, in my opinion, you want to look for those innovators and early adopters. These folks definitely know that this problem exists and they've acknowledged it. They may even know how painful it is or how much it costs to not solve it. And they might even be out there trying to solve it themselves. And in their case, it may be distracting them from their mission to solve this problem. So when you show up with a solution, they're super happy that you're there. And a lot of the time I've noticed now that they're oftentimes happy with what I would consider less than a full feature set if it just solves the problem remotely and helps them get back to focusing on their own priorities. So once you hit up the innovators and early adopters, you want to leverage the success there and then transition the momentum you build into the remainder of the segment and scale your product. If you haven't had a chance to check out the book, Crossing the Chasm, I definitely recommend it. There's a lot more characteristics and specificity about how the different segments behave and how to identify them. It's been very helpful for me in the past. So I've got a few examples here of companies that took the smallest viable market approach to define what their minimum viable product is. The first one is the Facebook. And when the Facebook first launched, it was very specific to students of Harvard. And it was then expanded to a few more universities and then the rest of educational institutions before then being open to the general public like it is now. Inevitably, starting out with just focusing on Harvard really helped them with catering their product to an experience that Harvard students find really engaging and delightful. And then they can kind of slowly expand that feature as it starts to gain popularity to then cater to university students in general, and then learning from that kind of expand further into the general public. So that's the first example. And you can kind of apply polish along the way to the different steps. The second one is Uber. While today they have tens of millions of customers and they move people, they move food, they move freight, they started out very specifically catering to folks who lived in San Francisco, who valued convenience over price. And this was in 2010, and they focused on folks who they knew would be comfortable with putting their credit card information on an app. And that way, again, they can get in, they can delight customers in the early days, and then rely on those folks to fund the future growth in certain cases, whether that's organic growth and they're profitable enough to do future development, or to show to investors like venture capitalists that, hey, here's the traction, here's the delight level. And those things are really important. So identifying that first market's really key, because you want those customers to be delighted. You want those customers to be referring your product to others. a really good example of this referral model has worked out for a company that we're friends with called Zor. They came out here to Detroit to participate in the Techstars cohort a few years ago. And the Integral folks got to know them pretty well. And what they do is that they come to your house and help you set up your tires, tire rotations, any other tire and wheelbase services. And today it's a service that any of us would want, especially with the way the world is today and not wanting to sit around in a waiting room of a service center. When they got started though, they focused very strategically on car enthusiasts, folks who would really care more than the average person about tires, wheels, how they were installed, who worked on them, how they worked on them, the level of care they expected. These are also coincidentally the folks that the rest of us would likely ask for advice when we're looking to buy tires online. That car enthusiast is the person that I would go to and say, hey, where should I buy tires? So if you delight those folks who are trying to solve this problem themselves, they also tend to be the folks that others kind of go to if you pick it from the innovators or the early adopters. And you know, in this case, they're the car people or the folks who are enthusiasts that are whose referrals are likely going to be a lot more valuable to you as well. So they got a lot of referral marketing in this case because they chose that segment really wisely. And that segment really loved them, I think, disproportionately for the early versions of their service than the mass market would. And then the last example I have is a customer of ours and a project that we got to work on together. May Mobility is a self-driving shuttle company based out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. At the time when we worked with them, they had their autonomous shuttles moving people around in downtown Detroit, in Rhode Island, and in Columbus. And they were about to do a pretty major launch in the city of Grand Rapids as an extension to the transit system. And so far, the May team had done a really impressive job of taking an extremely lean approach to creating a very human-centered, delightful shuttle experience. And they had a number of modifications that they had to do in order to cater to this new launch that they had in Grand Rapids. And part of that was the fact that it had way more stops than any of the launches that they'd done till then. So you get on and there was 20 different stops that you could get off at Grand Rapids compared to a handful of the other locations. And this posed a new set of challenges to create a delightful experience. So they came to us and they wanted us to help with building the in-vehicle infotainment system, the one that you can see Jaffer kind of pointing to and talking about. What you're seeing there is the original version, and we helped them with rebuilding this somewhat from the ground up in order to cater to the future of their vision and the new launches they had coming up. The great part about our approach that we took is that they wanted to focus just as much on Grand Rapids and that smallest market for this new product as we did. So we were able to cater the early versions of what we built specific to the problems of Grand Rapids, and then built it in a way that that the May team could then take it and then make it extensible to the other launches that they had. This helped us get out to market quickly in line with when they were launching in Grand Rapids. It allowed us back from Grand Rapids to influence changes to the app for Grand Rapids as well as they roll out to the others. So we got there faster, we got feedback earlier, and the amount of complexity to scale was reduced because we had a much better focus from the early launch that we did. So that's kind of the first challenge here is what's the smallest market that we should go to? The second question we often have will be, how do we scale from here? And there's a framework that I think is very useful in going on to serve other markets or building more features. And it's called Ansoff's Matrix. I think it's a really useful tool for prioritizing your next efforts. And it's also really helpful for having a very healthy conversation amongst teammates to get alignment. And as you can see on the bottom left, you can imagine your version 1 features were based on your smallest viable market. And then at that point, you got to decide whether it's more fruitful for you to kind of go further vertically up to new markets with what you've built, or serve your existing customers with new features and generate more value for them and hopefully more revenue for yourselves. What you want to be careful of is trying to do both. In the top right, where diversification is essentially talking about wanting to kind of split that up a little bit more, because it can be a little bit overwhelming and hard to maintain priority. From what I've seen, it's usually not like very straight lines. It's kind of a zigzag approach from the bottom left to the top right. And the other thing I would say when you're making these decisions is to be very, very mindful of how valuable customer feedback is. Think about how you're going to gather that post-launch, but implement and embed analytics systems as well as other experiments into your product roadmap well before launch for post-launch, so that after you launch, you can look at analytics, you can do customer interviews and get more qualitative data in order to help determine where on this matrix you want to traverse and go back and change your product roadmap. This is a really useful tool, and I might do a talk just about it in the future. And then the third is that, you know, this sounds really expensive. If you're going to market once, then we have to, you know, redesign and rebuild and retest these applications, and that all costs money. And oftentimes a point of hesitance is that cost. And one of the things that I think is really valuable for when you're working in uncertain areas, like oftentimes we are when you're working on innovative products or in R&D departments, you want to really think about optimizing for uncertainty and just acknowledging that you don't know everything out there. So let's get our center of gravity low and be ready to move direction rather than get our center of gravity long and try and get to the intended direction faster, because we don't really know what the right path is. And we do that by minimizing the cost of change, especially on the engineering teams. And some of the tools that I highly recommend that you have your engineering team consider are ones that help the team acknowledge the change is inevitable and to optimize for the uncertainty by leveraging test automation, or in our case, we really lean towards test-driven development. Continuous integration is another good one that automates a lot of steps in order to chip away and keep iterating. Solid design principles acknowledge the fact that this code needs to be changed in the future. And the more we think about anticipating that today, the more we're going to be thankful tomorrow when we have feedback and we want to make changes and go back to market feeling confident. And pair programming is another tool or a process that we follow that helps with spreading the context of your code across multiple teammates, and also getting a lot of feedback and input and ideas into the code base in order to have one that's, again, more maintainable, more scalable. So I highly recommend that in order to get the most benefit out of going to market early and then planning on iterating, that you minimize the cost of change. And these are some examples of what you can do from an engineering standpoint. So in summary, the three things that I think are really important to overcome the dreaded MVP or minimum viable product conversation is think about your smallest viable market. What's the smallest area in terms of effort that you can cover or focus that you can have, but is also big enough that it can be viable to get enough progress if it's successful. And then you want to consistently see customer feedback and reprioritize your roadmap. Use something like NSOS matrix to help kind of have the conversation and help do the critical thinking. And thirdly, optimize your engineering teams to embrace uncertainty and minimize the cost of change. So that's hopefully helpful. And I'm totally happy to have this conversation the next time you feel faced with having to redefine a product with the MVP features.